조던 피터슨이 오래전부터 자신의 마음 깊숙이 자리 잡고 있던 과학과 종교에 대한 뿌리 깊은 편견을 고백합니다.
You know, I think for a lot of my life, and certainly when I was younger, I really bought the doctrine that there was an unbridgeable gap between the scientific way of looking at the world and the Christian way of looking at the world, let's say. And that split, the apparent split between science and religion, was a consequence of an incommensurate dichotomy of worldviews, you know, and that the church had been opposed to scientific progress, at least in part because the scientific viewpoint existed in contradiction to Christian doctrine. But then, especially in recent years, in the last 10 years, I've started to understand that that was something like a French Enlightenment / rationalist propaganda campaign, that the relationship between science and Christianity is much closer than I had imagined. I cottoned onto this a little bit by reading Jung, but that just as the universities developed out of the monastic tradition, the notion that the natural world was intelligible to the inquiring logos, that it had an intrinsic logic, that studying it would be beneficial to man, first of all, that it would be comprehensible and beneficial, and that was actually a kind of moral obligation. That all struck me as axiomatic statements of faith that were predicated on the Christian tradition, that were the preconditions for the emergence of science. And, you know, I've tried to take that idea apart over the last 3 or 4 years to see if I can find any flaws in it. But I think the evidence that the universities emerged out of the monastic tradition instead of emerging contrary to that, that's absolutely incontrovertible on every grounds you could possibly imagine. And the notion that you need to believe in the intelligibility of the world, the capability of the human logos, and the beneficial consequence of acquiring knowledge, you have to believe in all that to even get the scientific enterprise going. I also think that's incontrovertible and that those are axioms of faith. And so I don't know if those views are in accordance with your views or what you think about that. So I'd like to hear what you think about that.
This is extremely interesting to me because I never saw the tension between Christianity and science, because very early on as a teenager, I was introduced to the writings of a scientist who was a Christian who drew my attention to something Alfred North Whitehead wrote. And it was really put in much simpler language by C.S. Lewis when he wrote, "Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver." And so very early on, and I was fascinated by the idea that actually modern science is a legacy of the biblical worldview. And therefore it's no accident that the pioneers, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Maxwell, and so on, were believers in God. And as you pointed out, it underpins the tradition that lies behind the great universities of the world, that the doctrine of creation was actually the belief, the underlying presupposition that allowed people to do science. So I've come over my life to the conclusion that science and the biblical worldview sit very comfortably together, but it's science and atheism that do not sit comfortably together.
즉 피터슨의 말처럼 프랑스 계몽주의 이후 자연주의 철학이 과학에 스며들어 종교와 과학을 마치 서로 적대하는 것처럼 그려낸 이념적 대립의 서사가 생겨났습니다. 그러나 애초에 과학은 진리를 파고드는 도구이고 종교는 그 진리를 해석하는 또 다른 언어입니다. 둘은 맥락이 다를 뿐 결코 서로 반대되는 개념이 아닌 것이죠. 한 학생이 묻습니다.
Dr. Lennox, St. Augustine said that reason is the enemy of faith. And I would like to ask you a question with regards to original sin. Why would you choose to worship a creator God who forbade man to actually eat from the tree of knowledge, one which you have obviously eaten from because you are a rather knowledgeable man? Why would you choose to worship this sort of deity who would have kept you dumb?
That's a very good question. I'll tell you why it's a good question. I notice it was asked originally by a snake. That is not implying any offense at all.
None taken.
Because, well, let me try to answer your question. The story in Genesis fascinates me because it is a story that defines for us what life really is. It defines it at its various levels, from the physical to the aesthetic, to family life, to work. And the highest thing in life, according to that story, is a relationship with God that's morally determined. And the issue was whether human beings could trust God or not. So there were two trees, as you know. The scene shows us the basic minima necessary for a moral being. Something forbidden, but freedom to take it. Now, what was the issue? The enemy said, has God really said you shan't eat of all the trees in the garden? Nonsense. And then he pointed out what you pointed out to me. God wants to suppress you, you see. He wants to keep you down. It'll cripple you intellectually, aesthetically, and everything else if you go for this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so they did, and they ate the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There are two ways of knowing good and evil. Notice not a tree of knowledge, by the way. God was very
In Hebrew it's called the Etz Hadat, and Dart means knowledge, not good or evil.
And is good or evil not mentioned?
No, it is not.
At all. Okay, I stand corrected there. I'd like to find out about that afterwards. But the fact that God is clearly not against knowledge is clear elsewhere in that very text. Because God actually started science by encouraging human beings to name the animals at the beginning of Genesis, which is what we call taxonomy. Now, to just very briefly wrap up on this, the notion that believing in God keeps you down is very common today. I was told when I was 19 by a Nobel Prize winner. He said to me, "Do you want a career in science?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Give up this childish notion of belief in God. It will cripple you intellectually completely, and you'll never make a career in science." I quietly said to him, "Sir, what have you got to offer me that I haven't got?" And he talked about emergent evolution. The answer to your question, though, is this. Do I worship a God who wants to keep me down? I'll tell you the kind of God I worship. I worship the kind of God who made me in his image and coded himself into humanity, came into our world to provide a basis through his death and resurrection that I could become something that I was not by creation, and that is a son of God. And the basic message of the Christian faith is a magnificent one, that God is prepared to give the individual who trusts Christ his very life, and that person rises in that sense and is given all the potential of God to be able to enjoy his friendship. The capacity of enjoying friendship with God is the biggest thing in my life, and it will be the biggest thing eternally. The notion that God is trying to keep us down is actually the original lie.
자연주의 철학의 관점에서 과학은 하나님을 경쟁자로 만듭니다. 그러나 복음이 보여주는 하나님과의 관계는 적도, 대적자도 아닙니다. 그분은 동행자, 심지어 친구이십니다. 하나님이 친구라는 사실 정말 믿기 어렵지 않습니까? 그분은 우리와 함께 일하시는 동역자, 곁을 지켜주시는 동반자이십니다. 결국 문제는 하나님이 아니라 우리가 하나님을 어떻게 대하느냐에 있습니다. 그분을 친구로 모실 것인가? 아니면 여전히 스스로 신이 되려 할 것인가? 왜냐하면 오늘 하루에도 우리는 수십 번, 아니 수백 번의 선택 앞에 서기 때문입니다. 그때마다 다시금 선악과를 따먹을 것인가? 아니면 주님과 동행하며 묻고 나아갈 것인가? 결국 딱 그것뿐입니다. 이제 복음을 아는 우리는 자발적으로 선악과가 아닌 길, 즉 우리 마음대로 신처럼 행하는 길이 아니라 하나님께 여쭈어보고 그분이 이끄시는 공동체 안에서, 그리고 무엇보다 직접 주신 이 말씀 안에서 분별하는 과정을 떠나지 말아야 합니다. 그리고 그 길 끝에 남는 것은 선악과가 아니라 언제나 십자가입니다. 그러니 신앙은 아이 같아야 합니다. 우리가 앞장서서 이제는 스스로도 잘 걷는다가 아니라 신앙이 깊어질수록 의존도는 오히려 더 커지고 은혜를 받을수록 마음은 더 여려집니다. 제가 여러 설교를 들으면서 한 가지 느낀 것은 겉은 그럴싸하지만 정작 복음이 빠져있는 경우가 있다는 것입니다. 마치 종교 권위주의처럼 지식과 학력이 높아도 화려한 그 기도 속에 은혜가 느껴지지 않을 때가 있죠. 그러나 매일 새롭게 은혜를 받는 노인이어도 아이처럼 하나님께 붙들린 목회자의 기도는 아이의 울부짖음처럼 더 순수하고 더 연약하고 사람들 앞에서 체면 따위가 없습니다. 물론 우리는 하나님께서 친히 세우신 교회와 목회자들을 향해 불신이나 냉소가 아닌 존중을 가져야 합니다. 그러나 동시에 형식보다 중요한 것은 복음에 붙들린 진실한 마음입니다. 과학과 종교, 즉 이성과 신앙이 대적하지 않듯 우리는 하나님 안에서 무엇이든 그분이 알게 하신 것들을 함께 걸으며 알아갈 수 있습니다. 그리고 그 모든 과정으로 하나님께 영광을 돌릴 수 있죠. 그래서 저는 외식하는 경건주의자가 되고 싶지 않기에 오늘도 계속해서 마치 존 레녹스와도 같은, 즉 아이와 같은 믿음을 구합니다. 성숙하여 이가 자라 어른의 영양식을 먹더라도 마음은 언제나 예수님이 사랑하시는 어린 양처럼 그분께만 붙들리기를 원합니다. 멀리 떨어져 있어도 우리는 주님 안에서 함께 걷는 영성의 공동체이기를 바라며 이 모든 작은 순간들을 함께 나누고 싶은 저란 사람은 유튜브 읽어주는 남자입니다.